Rainbow Six Siege just got a huge update, and with it came many buffs for a lot of operators, and even a rework for operators like Kali or Jackal. So if you're wondering where these operators stand, I'm going to be making an updated tier list for Year 9 Season 3. Let's get straight into it. First up, let's go over Ace. I think Ace is great. This isn't a normal tier list where it's like S, A, B, C. Great operators are operators that you could and should be using every single round. I think in terms of balancing, every operator should aim to be in this category. Meta operators are operators that arguably should be nerfed that I think are a little bit too strong. If you want an example of operators that I think belong in this tier, let's take a look at these shield operators. I think shield operators are extremely meta, and most players' scenarios where they don't know how to play shields, you could say that shields are bad, but I think even if you're a bad shield player, you can find yourself getting a lot of value out of shields. More so really with Monty than Blitz, so if you want to move Blitz down to great, I guess you could do that too, but I think shields are just a little bit too broken and a little bit too uncounterable, at least for my liking. Let's take a look at operators that are a little bit worse than any operators in meta or in the great category, however, like an operator like Frost. Now keep in mind, this is the good category, which means any operator I put in this category is still going to be good. If you play this operator, it's not a bad operator to pick. Do I think there are better options? Sure, but you're still going to get value out of these operators. In my opinion, operators only start to get bad, and you should really start avoiding them when you get to the rarely useful tier and the trash tier. So operators from good up, I recommend you to use, and you should use them. So I don't want you thinking that when I put like Frost here, or let's say Alibi here, that I think these operators are bad. They're not. You can be good at them and get some value out of them. But there are some operators where you can get a lot of value out of them, but really only in certain maps or certain situations. For example, let's talk about Mira. I'm not saying that Mira is worse than anybody up here or better than anybody below here. Think of the situational category off to the side as its own little tier list, because you can't quantifiably put a situational category above or below any other tier. That's like, it defeats the purpose of situational, if you know what I mean. Because Mira is really, really good, arguably great, just like Ace, but only situationally depending on the site if she's valuable or not. For example, the basement of Chalet, you might think Mira is really good, but if they have a ram, that Mira becomes completely useless. Whereas the basement of Oregon has no vert on it, making Mira a lot better. An operator that's also pretty site dependent would be Castle. Castle's pretty good on some sites like the top floor of Bank, but on other sites, he's just not really that useful and there's better picks. Moving on from the situational category, let's go to the rarely useful category. These are operators that are situational, but there's maybe like one, maybe two sites where they are situationally good, and even then, it's a toss-up whether these operators actually work or not. An operator like Fuse is a great example. I think people who play console think that Fuse is pretty good, and on console, I do think Fuse is better, to be fair. But I'm a PC player, I make videos predominantly for PC players, and on PC, Fuse is terrible. On PC, people have the ability, mechanically speaking, to be able to shoot Fuse cluster charges the second they get deployed, making Fuse very, very useless most of the time. On console, that's not really the case. They also have less reaction time whenever they actually react to a Fuse cluster charge, which makes him a lot better on console, but on PC, he's rarely useful. There's like maybe one or two sites like Basement of Chalet, for example, where he can actually be used. Aside from that, though, I just do not recommend playing this operator pretty much at all unless you're kind of trolling or you just want to run a third shield. Another operator that's pretty rarely useful would be Tachanka. There are some sites, like I said, with Fuse where like Tachanka can be useful. Let's say the Basement of Bank, for example. You can just stop them from planting in that default spot with long angles or lineups that you have with Tachanka, and it actually makes sense. Beyond that, though, just play Smoke or Goyo. Now let's move into the worst tier of the video, which is the trash tier. These operators are so bad, you don't even need to bother unlocking them. First up, let's talk about Blackbeard. It wouldn't be a Rainbow Six Siege tier list if Blackbeard wasn't in F tier. He's the worst operator in the game, predominantly because his ability doesn't work. You can shoot above the Blackbeard shield and still headshot Blackbeard players. If you have a high rate of fire weapon like Ella's Scorpion, you're going to melt that shield instantly and it's not going to do much. His primary guns also kind of suck. They really need to buff his primary AR, and if they don't, then he's going to stay in this tier for now. Now that I'm here, though, I'm just going to give you the two other operators that I think belong in this tier, and that is Amaru and Thunderbird. You could say that Amaru is rarely useful, but even when she is, I don't think she really is all that useful. You can do what Amaru does with a 3-speed on, like, there's just no reason to play Amaru most of the time, and Thunderbird is just the worst healing operator in the game. If you want to play Thunderbird, play Doc, you'll do way better of a job. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, why didn't I put Sens in this list? That's because I'm going to put Sens in rarely useful. I do think Sens is a little overhated. The only issue really with Sens is the fact that there's way too many counters to Sens. The fact that you can impact grenade smokes is stupid. You should not be able to use explosive to counter sends. I think having warden countering sends makes sense, no pun intended. And I think sends as guns are good. I think the fact that you are able to see where things are going to land when you throw them is really powerful for sends. And if they made sends less counterable, I think they actually could be viable now that people actually know how to roll the gadget. And there are some maps where sends is actually pretty useful, like kitchen or second floor on cafe. But beyond that, do not touch this operator. Like I said, anybody in these two tiers, they have maybe one or two uses, but beyond that, just play literally anybody else. Now, the first balancing change that I'm going to be going over in this video is the change that happened to Callie. If you don't know how Callie got changed, essentially, one, she got smoke grenades. This is good because it allows you to plant and cover your planter with a sniper, which is pretty nice. Attacking with a sniper sucks, but if you have the bomb down, you basically become the defender, and defending with a sniper, as you've seen with the Boss G, is very good. So I think allowing her to get plants down with smokes is pretty nice. They also made it to where the bullet trails from her snipers are way less obvious now, meaning you're not going to get pre-fired as much, but even then, with those slight tweaks, I don't think she has moved on my tier list, and I do think she is rarely useful. You can make an argument for situational, but even then, I think EMPs or Thatcher or even a Zero, if you're using Zero to get rid of utility, is always going to be better than Callie ever is. And there's one simple reason for that. Callie's devices destroy your hard breaching devices when they're on the wall. They shouldn't do that. That is the dumbest thing ever, and if they took that away, it would make Callie so much more viable. But because of the fact that she destroys your own teammate gadgets, making her way harder to use to get walls open, I have to put her in rarely useful. She also has a sniper that's pretty hard to use, and her secondary SMG is, well, a secondary SMG. You're not going to get many kills with that either, so I don't think Callie's that good. In the same vein, I also don't think Glaz is that good. A sniper operator, not much else I really gotta say. If you don't bring smokes, you don't get to have an ability. I don't really know what else I really have to say there. You can bump up to situational, but unless you're in a 5-stack and you're playing Pro League, I wouldn't even put it that far. Let's move on from the bad operators and let's talk about some actual good operators. Fenrir, I don't think is meta. Like, when you think about the meta and like who you need to be playing because they're really strong right now, Fenrir doesn't really come to mind for me. I do think Fenrir is such a strong operator. Do not get me wrong. I don't want people thinking that Fenrir is a bad operator, but I don't think they should nerf Fenrir. I think people ban Fenrir because they are A, either too lazy to deal with this gadget, or B, he's just annoying to deal with. You ban Clash not because Clash is some S-tier operator, but because she's just annoying. Same thing with Capcan, and I think Fenrir falls in that same vein. He's a great operator, do not get me wrong. If Fenrir is on the board, you play him. But when I think about the meta of like who people are playing right now to win the most rounds because of balancing things, Fenrir is not somebody who comes to my mind, especially after the nerfs. If you want to talk about the meta right now though, obviously the meta is shields, which to me on defense means that anybody who can counter shields is meta. And the first person that comes to mind is Legion. Not only is Legion great at countering shields, but there's the simple fact that Legion is a great solo queue operator. By the way, if you didn't know, this is a solo queue tier list. So if you're in a 5-stack, this tier list would look a little bit different, but for most people, even if you're in a 5-stack, this is the list that I think you should be going with. If you're ever playing a ranked game and you're like, I don't know who to play, I don't really have like a specific wants to play anybody, just pick Legion and you'll be completely fine. You have so much information, you do a lot of damage, you have a great primary SMG, you have a super shorty to be able to help your teammates make site setup. He's all around probably one of the best solo queue operators on defense, hands down, and is meta because he can counter shields. Now, if shields are meta, then chances are planting is also meta, which is why I also want to put Ying in meta. I do think Ying is a meta operator, not only because she helps plants, which are, you know, kind of meta with shields being in the game, but also rushing is meta if planting is meta and shields are meta. And if you want to rush, Ying is a great operator to help you rush. An 80-round LMG, 4 Ying Candelas that has multiple blinds in each Candela, 2 smoke grenades for a plant or be able to rush, and great cohesiveness with any of your teammates that have a brain that know how to push with a Ying. Not much I really can say other than that. I think Ying is just a great operator. If you disagree, you should try to play Ying a little bit for yourself. Moving on to another operator that actually got balanced pretty recently, let's talk about Zofia. If you don't know what happened to Zofia with this latest patch, essentially they took away her soft breach charges for hard breach charges. I think this is a great change. The one thing that sucks about Zofia is you can do everything you want to do on Zofia with an Ashe, except for stunning people, but because of screen shake intensity being able to be turned off, stuns don't really do much, and honestly, they never really have in the first place. But now that you're able to get hard surfaces open, I do think there are places where Zofia can be better than an Ashe. They intended with this change to make Zofia kind of played like Buck would be played or Capitao would be played, where you have these like situational type of places where you would use hard-reaching charges and stuns to be able to do something. So I do actually think that Zofia is good. It's a little bit too early because the patch hasn't even come out by the time of this recording. It just got announced. So I think it's a bit too early for me to like, you know, put her on a tier list and it makes sense. But for now, I will stick Zofia in good. I think the ability to have hard-reaching charges isn't going to make her situationally really good like a Capitao or a Grim, but I do think it's going to make her a little bit more comfortable to play for some solo queue players who maybe just want to play hard-reaching charges because they know their dumbass Thermite is about to get spawn peeked and die anyways. Now, I'm going to move back to the situational tier because there's a few people that I want to put in the situational tier that I will explain all at once. And that is the hard reachers, being Thermite, Hibana, and Maverick. Now you might be saying, why are these hard breachers in situational and Ace isn't in situational? Again, this is a solo queue tier list. If you were in competitive play, I would think that Ace would also be situational, but you're not. It's solo queue ranked. You can play Ace every single round of every single side of every single map and find usefulness out of Ace on some wall, I promise you. But that's not really the case with these three hard breachers. For example, if you're pushing top floor Oregon, trying to use a Thermite on the closet wall sucks because you have to take Master and cross trophy and the holes on the main hallway. Whereas Ace, you can just sit on the balcony and not have to face any single danger. But there are certain situations, like the kitchen wall from Small Tower, where it would make sense to use Thermite over Ace. On the basement of Bank, when you need to get 4 or even 5 hatches open for the round, it makes sense to bring a Hibana over either of these hard breachers. If they're running Cade Turbo, it makes sense to be running Maverick instead of these 3 hard breachers. So these 3 do have situational uses, which is why I'm putting them in situational, but you don't need to bring these 3 every single round. Like, you could honestly just bring an Ace. And just like these hard breachers are situational, I also want to say that Thatcher is situational. You don't need to bring a Thatcher every single time, but if you know that they have good players that are going to K-Trick or Bandit Trick, and you're not bringing anybody else with EMPs, I do think Thatcher can be a better option, especially if he is not banned. But because you have EMPs on a lot of very useful operators, you don't need a Thatcher unless either A, you have more than one main wall that needs to get opened, like Jim on Clubhouse, or B, somebody's tricking a wall and you know they're tricking a wall. Now that we've talked about wall people on attack being situational, I also want to talk about the wall people on defense. Those being Bandit, Cade, and Turbo. I think these are situational, again, depending on what attackers there are, who is banned, and what side is opened. For example, if you know they have a Thatcher, it would make sense to play Cade Turbo because you can put a Cade on the wall, it gets EMP'd, you Turbo it, and then when it gets unturbo, the Cade will be re-electrified by then and completely destroy anything that's on the wall. If either one of these is banned, then it makes sense to play Bandit instead. If you know that Maverick is banned, it makes sense to play Cade over Bandit. So, you know, there's just certain situational things that make either one of these operators better. There isn't one operator that is just downright better than the other because they both bring certain things to the table that the other one doesn't bring, even Turbo. Next up, I'm going to talk about Ashe. I think Ashe is great. I don't think she's really meta. There's nothing really meta-defining about her where it's like, you need to play her this season because this season specifically, she's really good. She's been good for the past, like, year and a half. She like, honestly, when she got the ACOG, she has been great ever since. And even before then, when she was at her lowest of lows, people still played Ashe. She's a great and arguably the best entry fragger in the entire game, so go ahead and play some Ashe, but I won't say that she needs to be nerfed like these operators up here. The same exact thing can be said for Buck. I think Buck is a great solo queue operator. You should be playing Buck every single round. In terms of positioning and map awareness, I think if you play Buck, you will get both of those attributes about yourself a lot quicker than any other attacker, and even if you're really good at the game, Buck can still be useful to just open up sightlines that you couldn't do on any other operator. Now, let's go over another operator that did get balanced pretty recently, and that is Mozzie. Now, if you go back to my previous tier list, and I think the one before that too, I talked about how I wanted Mozzie to get a 4th pest or a super shorty to make rotates. And boys, he got a 4th pest. Ubisoft is listening, baby. It all came true. Not only that, but he has a way to make rotates for himself now, which makes him an even better roamer. He didn't get a super shorty, but he got something even better, and that's impact grenades. Not only can he make himself rotates now, but he can also counter shields and finish off people who are downed. He doesn't have an ACOG, but honestly, I don't think he should have an ACOG. I think him having 4 pests is just what he needed, and some ability to make himself rotate on the fly as well, and that's exactly what he got. I love this change for Mozzie, and because of that, he's going to move out of rarely useful and into good. I put him pretty low in most of my other tier lists because I didn't think he was all that good. Mute could just do what he did, but better and more reliably. But now that he is a 4th pest and he has the ability to have impact grenades and roam a little bit better, I do think that there is room to play Mozzie now. The only issue with Mozzie and why I'm not placing him just a little bit higher is for the simple fact that there's one operator that does what he does, but just way better. And if you didn't see this coming, this operator's Vigil. Now, you can make an argument for putting Vigil in Great, but I'm going to make the argument that you put him in meta. Here's why. People are just now realizing that the Boss G is an outstanding weapon. I don't know why it took us as Siege players years to figure this out, but ever since they gave the Boss G an ACOG, it has been great, and with the SMG-12 as a great secondary sidearm with impact grenades to counter shields or make yourself rotate, and an ability that is absolutely great for wasting time, I think Vigil is great. Like I said, people who are in meta are people that I think deserve to be nerfed, and I do think the Boss G just needs to be reworked or nerfed in some way for him to be balanced. The fact that he's being banned more than he's ever been banned in the entire history of him being an operator is proof that people are not really happy with the state that Vigil is in, and in my opinion, I agree with them. Now let's move over to Sledge. I think Sledge is good. I think he's not that good, to be honest, but it's not like bringing a Sledge is ever going to hinder you like it is if you bring any of these operators down here. So I don't think it would really make sense to put him down here for the sake of the tier list, but I'll stick him in the lower part of good for now. Next up is Goyo. I think Goyo is great. You can make an argument for good, but I think this distinguishment between these two tiers is so little that it doesn't even matter that much, to be honest. Goyo, though, is a great operator, especially for solo queue ranked. You have an ACOG on both of his primary weapons, which are absolutely outstanding, by the way. You have impacts to counter shields or make yourself rotate. You have the easiest ability in terms of entry denial that you can have for any defender in the entire game. And the best part about it is you don't even need to be there to use it like you do with Smoke or Tachanka. Your teammates can use it. If they break down a barricade, it can be automatically used, and it has the longest lasting fire with the biggest radius of a fire in the entire game, which makes Goyo a great operator, at least in my opinion. Now, there are certain operators that I do want to talk about. You might not agree with me on this one, by the way, but there's 3 operators that I think also belong in the situational category, and they're all the drone operators, that being Flores, Twitch, and Brava. Now, like I said, none of the operators in the situational category are technically below the operators above them or above the operators below them. So before I see all of the console kids crying, going, why is Twitch below Goyo? I don't want to hear it. She's not below Goyo. She's in the situational category because she's situational, okay? Deal with it. If they have a castle, Vigil, Doc, Rook, and Smoke, what are you going to do as Twitch? Use her gun? Bring somebody else with a good gun, like Ace, who actually brings utility. So if there are situations where Twitch's ability is completely useless, then logically speaking, she is a situational operator. You're only going to use Twitch, or at least use her and get value out of her, when there is utility that she can counter. If there's no utility that she can counter, she's going to be pretty useless. The same exact thing can be said for Flores. If they don't have bulletproof utility, or some sort of like barricade utility like Castle or Barbed Wire, then he's going to be pretty useless too. If they have nothing that you can hack, then Brava's going to be useless. Most of the time, they're not though, but you can count on there being certain lineups of selfish players that just don't really run utility that you can use these 3 operators to counter, which technically speaking, to be fair to the tier list, makes them situational. I don't like it, but by definition, it is what it is. I had to throw them in this tier. Next up is Doc and Rook. Now, I have a certain opinion on these operators that most people might not agree with. I'm going to put Rook in the great category. I know this is going to piss some people off, but I want you to hear me out. When it comes to this tier list, I'm not somebody that really goes into tier lists like opinionated. I come into it with statistics, and statistically speaking, Rook has had the highest win rate out of any defender for both PC and console for I think the past year or even 2 years. I don't know why, and that's not for competitive, that's not for low elo, that is plat and above ranked. He has had the highest win rate. You can say as a PC player, like, oh, he's not really that useful because there's not a lot of situations where you can revive yourself. Sure, but having extra health, whether you like to admit it or not, does help you. It makes you slightly more confident, so you're more likely to swing and take more gunfights and win more rounds. The ability to self-revive also makes you play different, which can make you win more. Self-reviving to is great. It gives you a second chance at life. There is a reason that they took out Zophia's withstand, because a second chance at life is absolutely huge, whether people want to realize it or not. Also, having an ACOG on defense is great, especially on a low recoil SMG. When Warden have the 1.5, everybody found that that was overpowered. It's the same exact thing with an ACOG, and he also has impacts to counter shields or make himself rotate. Somebody who is even more versatile than Rook that also has a high win rate and a high pick rate is Doc. Doc, I think, is a great solo queue operator. You have the ability to help your teammates make site setup, and knowing your bum-ass teammates and mine, they're not doing that shit. Barbed wire for information is also pretty cool, or a BP on some sites where that can be useful. Again, an ACOG on a low recoil SMG, whether it be the MP5 or the P90, it does not matter. And then the ability to heal your teammates from 1 HP or a down state all the way back to full gives you a second chance at life that is even better than Rook's in my opinion. So as much as most content creators and good comp players want to downplay these operators in a ranked environment, listen, some people may lie, but the numbers don't. These operators have proven time and time again that even if people think they're bad, they perform extremely well, even in the high ranks. Now, I know I was pretty opinionated on that one, but I'll dial it back and I'll talk about an operator that I think is slightly less controversial when I talk about it, and that's Thorn. Thorn is rarely useful. You can honestly make an opinion for putting Thorn here. That's just me though, but for most people, I think there are certain uses where Thorn can be good if you're pairing her up with like 2 sets of barbed wire, a Malusi Banshee, and an Elamine, but unless you're doing that, Thorn is just never really useful. I don't really like using her gun. It's too low rate of fire for me. No ACOG as well. The best thing she honestly brings is a deployable shield, which you can bring on many other operators. Next up is Cav. Cav is a weird one to place for me because, like, as much as I love to hit on Cav and everyone loves to hit on Cav because her ability is pretty useless, everything except for her ability is kind of useful. I think interrogations are cool, and in most solo queue ranked lobbies, you actually are able to pull them off if you know when and how to flank. I think impact grenades are also kind of cool as well, to be able, again, to, like, counter shields or make yourself rotate on the fly. So if you're in lower elo, I think you can actually get away with playing Cav and play her pretty well. But I think beyond that, she is a dog terrible operator. So I don't really want to make an operator that's like ranked dependent, because rank and hit MMR doesn't really matter. You can have champs and copper, so I'll put Cav in trash. I think that's fair. I'll put her in trash. Let's talk about another operator that did receive changes with a new patch though, and that is going to be Jackal. The only change that Jackal received wasn't really like a balancing change. It was more of just a quality of life change. If you're curious, all they did was they made it to where when you take damage, it doesn't distort your vision when you have your Jackal thing active. It stays the exact same. Now, if you're in a gunfight with your Jackal thing active, you're not just blind, you can actually see, which is kind of cool. It's a slight buff, I guess. Not really that impactful, just, again, quality of life. Because it's not really that impactful of a change, I'm going to stick him in the same category that I've been sticking him in, and that is great. I don't think Jackal's overpowered. I think Jackal's actually pretty balanced, especially compared to somebody like Dokkaebi, but I do think he's a great operator. You should play him every single site that you're able to play him on, especially on bigger maps when he can cover more ground and be more useful. Speaking of roam clear operators, though, let's talk about the next operator, which is Dokkaebi. I think Dokkaebi is meta. She is able to really help execute heavy metas, which, you know, we're in right now, like I talked about earlier. She has a boss G, which I talked about earlier, being very good. And she's about as versatile as an operator can get. She has flash grenades if you want to get kills. She has EMPs if you want to get a wall open, or again, smokes if you want to be able to do and execute with these operators here. So not only is she meta, but even on her own, if you're not doing some meta strat, I guess, she's still a completely good operator. And I honestly think she's a little too versatile, and if they nerfed her again, I would not complain, which is why I put her in the meta tier. Next up is Azami. I honestly wouldn't say that Azami is meta. Like, I don't know. Azami as a concept is a crazy good operator, but in practice, I do think she's really good, but I don't think she's as, I guess, meta as like a Monty or a Blitz or a Ying. She's technically not a meta operator. She's just good all around in any meta that you put her in, kind of like an Ace would be, right? So I think for the sake of the definition of the tier list, I'll put Azami in great. I think Azami is a great operator. People aren't banning her nearly as much because, you know, she isn't bulletproof anymore. People are kind of learning how to play around the operator, but I do still think if I were doing like a normal S, A, B, C, F tier list, I'd put her in S tier for sure. But I don't think she needs to be really nerfed again. I think she's a pretty good operator nonetheless, though. If you want to put her in meta, I understand. Honestly, if there were a tier in between great and meta, that's where I'd put her, because I can't decide. It's a weird placement. If you want to put her in meta, I understand. Next up is Solus. Now Solus, I don't really think got nerfed too hard as much as people think she did. I think she just got changed, and she's a little bit harder to play for doing the exact same job. You can honestly, in my opinion, stick her in good. Like, she is a good operator, there's just going to be better operators like up here to play. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think Solus is about as useful as a Sledge or as Ophia or these operators here. Damn, but I do think Mozzie's better, so maybe I move Mozzie up a tier. I think I'm going to move Mozzie up a tier, actually, now that I'm looking at it. Sorry about that, but yeah, I think Mozzie's actually pretty great. I think Mozzie's a good operator. Again, it's a little too early for me to tell, so you can kind of chalk any of the new operators I'm talking about, but I do think Mozzie with impacts and a 4th pest, ooh, I'm excited to play that. Next up, let's talk about Ella. I think Ella's good. I think the fact that you can counter shields with Ella is great. But now that I'm thinking about it, there are just better counters to shields, like Vigil Impacts or especially Legion, or the next operator that I'm going to talk about, which is Melusi. Now for ranked, I do think Melusi is meta, but I don't think that she necessarily needs to be nerfed. So I'm going to put her at like the top of great. By the way, none of these operators in their tiers are like ordered. I'm not saying Ashe is like worse than Jackal or Ashe is better than Buck. They're not like in order. But if I was going to put her anywhere in the tier list, I'd probably put her at like the top of great. Melusi's pretty good. Impacts a counter shield, which can be meta. Information in a solo queue environment, which is always going to be meta. A shotgun to help set up for your team. A great low recoil SMG, just a good operator all around, especially on console. Next up is Sentry. I think this is the most overrated operator of all time, literally ever. I'm gonna put him in rarely useful. I don't think Sentry's that good. There are some instances where maybe Sentry can be useful, but even in those instances, you can just bring a different operator and it'd be better. I do think though the attacking recruit Striker is a lot better than Sentry. I think you can stick Striker. Again, this is a solo queue ranked tier list. I think you can stick Striker in great. The ability to get a wall open by yourself is pretty cool, especially on maps where you need to get a lot of walls open. Like if you already have a Thatcher and a Thermite, but you're on a site like Gym of Clubhouse where there's like 3 or 4 walls you need to get open. We're talking the CC wall, the cash wall, maybe even a Logi wall if there's a mirror on it, the jacuzzi wall, maybe even the bathroom wall. Like you just have so much stuff you have to get open. Bringing somebody else to just get walls open more and with an EMP by yourself as a solo queue player is pretty nice. Next up, let's talk about Maestro and Echo. I think his operators are good. I think Echo is just a bit too hard to play for such little value, and as somebody who is probably the biggest Echo nerd out of any content creator you'll ever watch, I'm even saying that, so Echo's kind of mid. Maestro, same thing. Brava just completely counters this operator, and so does Thatcher, and I find that most of the time you're not really getting that much use out of Maestro, even if he's not getting countered, because he does such little damage that it doesn't really affect that much on the board. Somebody else who is a lot more effective in my opinion though is Smoke. Smoke will always be great. You can make an argument for putting Smoke in good, but that's just honestly if you're a bad Smoke player. I will say for console players, Smoke is actually the lowest wand width defender in the entire game, even lower than like Clash, which is kind of crazy to me. So it kind of makes me want to put Smoke in good with the rest of these, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend that Smoke is as bad as Alibi or Solus or Sledge, so I'm going to go ahead and put Smoke in great. I think that's fair. I don't know, Smoke's a hard one to rank for me because I like the operator. I think he's good, but you have to be good with him for him to be good, so I don't know. Somebody that you can be terrible with though and get a lot of value out of still would be Lion. Lion's great. I don't really know how to put it. Low skill floor, high skill ceiling, versatile, overall a great operator, great ability. What more can I really say? Mute is great. I don't think Mute is meta. I don't think he needs to be nerfed, but I do think he's a great operator. You should play Mute every single round that you get the chance to. I'm going to fill the situational tier a little bit more with operators like Ram and IQ. Ram is site dependent. If you're on a top floor objective and you can't get Vert on the top floor, there's no point to play Ram, so she's site dependent. IQ is dependent. If there is no utility that you're trying to search for, like Vault Cams or Echo Cams, IQ is completely useless. Osa, I'm going to get a lot of hate for my take on Osa, but I'm gonna put Osa in rarely useful. Even in Pro League, when people are 5-stacking and they have strats they've practiced hundreds of hours with on Osa, Osa is still one of the worst attackers, statistically speaking, that you could bring. I think now that more people are bringing impact grenades, and you have operators like Monty and Blitz who can do her job but better, Osa just doesn't see a lot of gameplay. She has good guns, and her ability can be useful, especially in ranked. I know ranked is different than Pro League, so I guess it's not really a fair comparison to make. She can be better, but I just find that most of the time that Osa's played, she's not that useful. I'll stick her in good. I don't think it's fair to say that Osa is bad as like Sens or Tachanka. I'm fucking tripping. I think Osa's good. I think that's fair. Now let's talk about another operator that recently did get balanced in the patch notes, and that is Yana. I think Yana, or Ayana, however you say her name, is better because of the patch notes. If you don't know what happened, essentially, you know how whenever you shoot a Yana clone, it has more of a cooldown to recharge, whether it compared to it being not shot? Well, now they reduced that cooldown. Instead of it taking 30 seconds for it to recharge, charge, it only takes 20. That's the only change they made to her though, and I think fundamentally as an operator, she's just pretty weak compared to other operators. So I'll stick her in good. I do think she's a good operator. She brings good guns, good secondary utility. Still a good piece of utility, but I don't think it's like great compared to like, you know, Ace or something like that. Next up is Oryx. I think Oryx, I have to throw in situational. You can make an argument from meta because yes, he does counter shields, but any good shield player is just going to avoid the Oryx dash. It's very easy to do if you have more than 5 hours on Blitzer Monty. All you have to do is unextend your shield, move to the side, and he Oryx dashes into a wall, you ADS, and shoot him in the face. It's not hard to do. So I'm not going to put him in meta because Legion just does his job but better. I'll put him in situational though, because there are certain situations on certain maps where like you can play Oryx and guarantee not miss your Oryx dash. Like Rafters of Clubhouse. If there's a Monty in Rafters and you're in Rafters, you're not missing that dash because there's nowhere the shield can move to be able to dodge your Oryx dash. So I'll put him in situational for now. Next up, let's talk about Finka. I mean, an LMG with flash grenades and a good ability. I think Finka at the very least deserves good. I honestly think Finka is great. If Ash and Buck are taken and you still want to run him with a gun, Finka, in my opinion, is the next best thing. I know her ability can seem a little bit useless at times, but again, win rates don't lie. And again, LMG with flash grenades, like just so good. She's also really good if you have shields on your team, because if they are nerfed in any way, whether it be because of shield suppression, guard break, or any set of other nerfs that apply to shields whenever they're shot or have things applied to them like stuns, Finka can get rid of that almost completely. If you have anybody that steps in a frost mat as well, Finka can get rid of that debuff too. So she's great at reducing debuffs if you're going for a rush or an execute, and I think for that reason, she can move up from good to great in my opinion, but if you put her in good in your head, I understand why. Next up is Warden. I think Warden, you can put in either situational or great. The reason for this being is because I think Warden you can only really use on sites where you know they are probably going to do a smoke plant. Sites like the basement of Chalet, archives on border, or literally anywhere where you can think of a smoke plant, right? But even then, sometimes it doesn't even happen. And playing Warden outside of those sites, in my opinion, doesn't make sense when you can play an operator like Melusi or Legion, or even Vigil. So I do think he's pretty site dependent or rush dependent, but I don't think he's necessarily meta defining because you don't really need to be able to see through smokes to counter people inside of them. Next up is Pulse. Pulse is pretty rarely useful. I think he's situational in the sense where like you can play him situationally on sites, but even then, you can do what Pulse does with Valkyrie, and Valkyrie do it better with a better weapon. Speaking of Valkyrie, I'll put Valkyrie in great. I don't think she's necessarily like super meta or needs to be nerfed, but I think she's a great operator. Can't really say much more about that. Next up is Jaeger and Wamai. You can make an argument for Jaeger and Wamai being in great or good. If there was a tier in between, that's where I'd put him, but I'm gonna stick him in great because I think the ability to not get flashed or grenaded in a spot or even capitowed or grimmed in a spot is really powerful if you know that they're going to bring utility like that, let's say on Cache of Clubhouse, for example. So still can be pretty good operators, and most of the time, even if you're not on a site where you really need it, it's still going to get value somehow. Next up is Nomad. I think Nomad is a little overrated, but I think she is the most useful when you're using her to counter runouts, which is pretty dependent on the map that you're playing. On Cafe, Nomad is great because there are tons of runouts, but on a map like Villa, where there's only like maybe 2 or 3, she's not all that useful, and you can just use claymores and do what she does, but better. Now you might be saying, but you can use Nomads for flanks. Not really. What most people don't realize is that you can just shoot air jabs on the flank before they even see you. Nomad air jabs actually have a delayed reaction time. That's why sometimes you're able to kill people when you run out before the air jab affects you, and then they'll start angrily typing in chat like their air jab didn't work, when in reality, it did. Air jabs just kinda suck. There's not a single doorway, staircase, or archway that you put an air jab on that a defender can't just slowly crouch walk up to and shoot before it sees the defender. Any really good defender knows that you could just counter air jabs with 1 bullet every single time flawlessly if you actually know what you're doing. So if you can't use her for flanks, you situationally really can only use her for runouts. Next up is Grim. I do think Grim is meta, but only in Pro League and only if you're 5 stacking. For the average solo queue player, I don't think Grim is that useful because Grim's whole thing is I'm gonna give everybody information so we can execute onto a room or onto a site. Most teams, especially if you're solo queuing, don't have the coordination for an execute, which means Grim is just less valuable. So in my opinion, for the solo queue ranked populace, I'm gonna put him in great, maybe even in good, but anything lower than that is just you don't know how to play Grim, so go ahead and play him some more and come back to me. Next is Nock. I think Nock went from arguably like the rarely useful category to at least good in my opinion. I think the ability to have an infinite amount of time that you can sit under cameras is absolutely great, especially on maps like Bank or Chalet, where you know there are cameras everywhere all the time. which means if they have any flank watch, they will not be able to see you at all. But other than that, I don't really see use of player over people like Ashe or Buck. Next is Kapkan. Kapkan is great for solo queue ranked, always will be. Just like Rook, he's one of the most won-with defenders in the entire game, and there's a reason for that. He's pretty reliable, always will be. Aruni, I'm gonna put in good. I think Aruni is a little overrated. If they bring a Brava, you're cooked. If they bring one set of flash grenades, all 3 of your Aruni gates are cooked, and you're a 3 armor. You're kind of just cooked. Next is Capitao. Capitao's pretty sight situational. His firebolts don't really get much use unless there's a specific place where you know they're going to work, like half wall on border or rafters of clubhouse. Next is Scopos. I think Scopos is actually, I don't know, it's still too early to tell, to be honest, but I think the lowest that you can put Scopos is good. That's the lowest you can put Scopos. If you look at the actual statistics, people are winning with Scopos a lot. Impact grenades, a great gun, 2 separate health bars, 2 separate ammo counts, and you can waste a lot of time on the roam and then just teleport back to site like nothing happened. Great ability in my opinion. So honestly, might be a hot take, but I'm gonna put Scopos in situational because Scopos is better on some sites like the top floor of Oregon when you can just waste time in T3 and TP back to site than on maps like Chalet where there's no cover to teleport if you're playing Library trying to teleport back to the 2nd floor and you're just gonna get smoked, right? So site dependent in my opinion, so I'm gonna put Scopos in situational. Next up is Deimos. Deimos is site dependent. He's completely useless if you're trying to use him for vert on some sites because some sites don't have vert on them, like the basement of Clubhouse, like the basement of Oregon. But he is useful on some sites, so I'll put him in situational. Gridlock is great in my opinion, one of the most slept on operators in the entire game and always has been. EMPs or smokes, a super shorty, frag grenades as well if you want to use those, a great primary AR, and an ability that's arguably one of the best flank watch abilities in the entire game, and very site executable heavy if you want to be able to go for a smoke Gridlock plant with any of these operators up here. Not necessarily meta, but a great operator in my opinion. Next up is Clash. I think Clash is at the lowest, good. I think Clash is a good operator. You can play her all of the time, and I think it would make sense because you completely counter shields, you counter rushes, and you can hold space. But there's some sites where it is just terrible to play Clash, like Kuka on Coastline. Way too many angles and windows, but there's some maps where she's great, like Basement of Oregon. So I'll put her in situational because she is kind of site dependent in my opinion. But now let's go over the last operator that got balancing changes to them, and that would be Zero. If you don't know, Zero got a significant buff. Instead of having 4 cameras, Zero now has 6. I think that's crazy. In most of my tier list, I put Zero in good because in higher elo, most of your cameras are just going to get shot. For lower elo players, Zero is a great operator. It's actually one of the best in my opinion, but if you're in higher elo, Zero just sucks because they're just going to shoot your cameras. If they have a headset or their monitor is turned on, that is what's going to happen. But now that you have 6 cameras, you can afford to waste a few. You also can afford to use him for burn, and he's way better at flank watching because you can put multiple cameras on a flank, and you still have some left over to get utility. So I think at this point, he might even become a better version of Twitch. So at the very lowest, I think Zero's good, but honestly, in my opinion, with the new buff, I want to say that Zero might be great, but let me know your opinion because, again, it's way too early to tell, and sub to the channel if you're new. My name's Alka, and I'll see you in the next video. Later.